Have you ever found yourself reading a really profound text, maybe like a classic piece of literature or a philosophical treatise or even a sacred religious document, and suddenly you just realized you were completely missing the point?
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time.
Right. It's like imagine walking into the Louvre, fighting through those massive crowds to get to the Mona Lisa. And when you finally stand in front of it, you spend the entire time just like intensely admiring the craftsmanship of the wooden frame.
That is a great analogy. It's a phenomenon of misdirected attention. You
Exactly.
walk away genuinely believing you've engaged with the art, perhaps even feeling deeply moved by the whole experience, while having entirely ignored the masterpiece itself. Because the frame is meant to hold the painting, but human psychology often gravitates toward the tangible, easily digestible boundary, right? Rather than the complex reality it actually contains.
Yeah, we like the safe edges.
Yeah.
And today, for this deep dive, we are looking at a misdirection on a civilizational scale.
We really are.
We're going to examine a very specific set of texts. These are the philosophical and socioeconomic lectures of Allama G.A. Parwez. And specifically, we are exploring his rationalist analysis of a crucial passage in the Quran, which is Surah Al-Imran, verses 192 through 194.
Right, the core verses.
Yeah. And this is where that Mona Lisa metaphor really hits the ground running, because we are dealing with a massive, almost globally pervasive misconception. I'll call it the ritual trap.
The ritual trap, I like it.
Because every single day, millions of people recite these exact verses. They memorize the cadence, they perfect the pronunciation, and they treat them basically as traditional theological supplications. They say these words hoping for some sort of individual mystical blessing or, perhaps a favorable position in the afterlife.
Which completely neutralizes the actual text.
Right.
I mean, when a society treats a demanding, rigorous framework as just a mere religious placeholder, they strip it of its utility entirely.
Yeah, it becomes just a chant.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how Parwez's analysis shatters this mentality. He argues that this specific passage has been fundamentally misunderstood for centuries.
Wow.
The sources we are analyzing today, they reframe these verses not as a passive prayer that you just whisper in isolation, but as a comprehensive, highly actionable civilizational blueprint.
A blueprint.
Yes. And the core demand of this blueprint is something that fundamentally challenges traditional religious thought. It demands the absolute, inseparable synthesis of empirical scientific inquiry and divine revelation, or wahi.
So we aren't talking about a theology lesson today.
Not at all.
We are talking about decoding the architectural schematics of an entire society. We need to look at the ultimate economic engine these verses propose and uncover what Parwez identifies as the inescapable social physics that govern the rise, the stagnation, and the utter collapse of nations.
That's the core of it, yeah.
But to even approach that blueprint, we face a major translation problem. I mean, if I hand you a schematic for a nuclear reactor, but you think the word uranium actually means incense.
The reactor is going to fail spectacularly.
Right, you're going to have a bad time. So we have to translate the vocabulary of this text from passive religious definitions to active systemic ones.
Well, the linguistic hijacking of these terms is really the root of the issue here. Over centuries, as Islamic civilization encountered different empires and philosophies, the original, highly pragmatic terminology of the Quran was co-opted.
Like Greek philosophy and stuff.
Exactly. Hellenistic philosophy, mystic traditions, they all seeped in and altered the lexicon. Words that originally described tangible, socioeconomic, and political actions were softened into these abstract spiritual feelings.
Interesting.
We see this even with basic concepts like salah, which traditionally became defined merely as the ritual of prayer. But systemically, Parwez identifies it as the establishment of a tangible divine roadmap for society.
That is a huge shift.
Or take sabr. Usually that's translated as passive patience, enduring suffering quietly. But in a systemic context, it actually means relentless, proactive steadfastness in maintaining an equitable social order.
Okay, so let's apply that exact lens to the specific vocabulary from our sources today, starting with the term batil.
Batil, yes.
Because if I open a standard traditional translation right now, batil is generally rendered as falsehood or sin. It's framed as a moral failing. Like, you told a lie, you committed a sin, you engaged in batil.
Right, but Parwez argues that rendering is entirely too narrow to serve as the foundation of a civilizational blueprint.
Okay.
In his rationalist methodology, batil is fundamentally a mirage. It is a subjective illusion.
Illusion.
Yes, it represents any pursuit, any philosophy, or societal structure that yields no constructive, objective results in the real world.
Wow.
And the text points out that Parwez is using this definition to mount a direct, devastating critique of Platonic idealism, of mysticism, which is often referred to as tasawwuf, and the concept of Maya found in Vedantic philosophy.
Okay, hold on. Let me challenge the inclusion of those philosophies for a second. Because Plato is foundational to Western thought. And mysticism, I mean, that's often viewed as the ultimate pinnacle of spiritual enlightenment across multiple global religions.
Oh, for sure.
So what is the danger in a philosophy that promotes spiritual detachment? Why is Parwez going after that?
Well, to report impartially on Parwez's stance here, the danger lies in what happens to the physical world while you are busy detaching from it.
Okay.
Because these philosophies share a core tenet. They teach that the physical material universe is essentially an illusion, a phantom. In Platonic thought, the physical world is merely a flawed shadow of true forms that exist in some non-material realm.
Right, the allegory of the cave.
Exactly. And in various mystic traditions, the universe is viewed as a dream state, a distraction. True enlightenment requires escaping this physical illusion to merge with a higher reality. So sensory knowledge, perceptual observation, the study of matter, all of it is deemed inherently unreliable and spiritually inferior.
I want to ground this with a modern analogy because it sounds exactly like treating the physical world as a virtual reality simulation.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You put the VR headset on, and a certain philosophy tells you, hey, listen, none of this is real. The trees aren't real, the poverty isn't real, the disease isn't real.
So it doesn't matter what happens inside the simulation.
Right. Your only goal is to sit quietly in the digital corner and figure out how to take the headset off. But Parwez is arguing that this physical world isn't a simulation to escape. It's the actual physical hardware we need to survive. If you ignore the hardware, the whole system crashes.
Consider the staggering socioeconomic implications of a society adopting that VR mindset. When a collective community, a malat, internalizes the philosophical view that the universe is batil, a mere mirage, their behavior completely changes.
How so?
They withdraw. They cease funding empirical science. They abandon the study of objective reality entirely. The brightest minds of that society don't go into hydrology, agriculture, or engineering.
They retreat into monasteries.
Exactly, monasteries or esoteric meditation circles.
Because, I mean, why would you study the molecular structure of a mirage?
Right.
If the world is an illusion, studying geology or biology is literally a waste of a life.
And by withdrawing from scientific inquiry, they set the stage for their own systemic destruction. They fail to conquer the natural forces of the earth. They don't build dams to control floods. They view the flood as an illusion or some mysterious divine test to be endured.
Wow.
They don't develop medicine. They view the plague as a spiritual cleansing. This philosophical retreat from the physical universe leads directly to the next crucial term in the text, which is al-nar.
The fire.
The fire.
The concept of al-nar, or hellfire, is practically universal.
Mm-hmm.
In almost every major religious tradition, it is viewed exclusively as a literal post-mortem punishment. It's the lake of fire waiting for sinners after they die, the ultimate threat of the afterlife.
Right, but Parwez relocates that fire entirely. Within this Quranic socioeconomic system, nar is not waiting for you after death.
Wait, really?
Really. Systemically, nar is the natural, inevitable state of a nation that has abandoned the scientific outlook we just discussed. It describes the immediate worldly hell of economic dependency, societal humiliation, and sociopolitical subjugation.
So we are talking about a worldly hell, burning right now in this life, not in some abstract future.
Look at the mechanics of it. When a nation fails to harness the forces of nature because they believe the universe was just a spiritual waiting room, they don't simply evaporate peacefully.
Yeah, they still have to eat.
Exactly. They still need medicine. They still need infrastructure. And because they cannot produce these things themselves, they become utterly dependent on other nations. Specifically, the nations that did study the material world for their basic survival.
That makes a lot of sense.
The sources we are examining describe this state vividly. It's a nation reduced to extreme need, living on the scraps of charity thrown into their laps by dominant, scientifically advanced nations.
Living on the scraps of charity, that is a brutal, visceral image. And it connects to a specific word the text highlights, aksaitahu.
Aksaitahu, yes.
Usually, I see this translated simply as disgrace.
Yeah.
You enter the fire, you face disgrace. It sounds like a personal feeling of shame.
Parwez interprets Tahu as structural geopolitical humiliation. It is the public international shame that intrinsically accompanies economic subservience.
So it's systemic shame.
Exactly. If your nation is relying on foreign aid packages, international monetary loans, and external charity to build your schools and feed your citizens, your sovereignty is an illusion. Your survival is entirely dictated by the pity, or more accurately, the strategic interests of your exploiters. You cannot have an independent foreign policy when your economy is sustained by a foreign treasury.
I want to dig into that concept of strategic interest, actually, because that brings up another term, ansar, which means helpers or allies.
Right.
And the verse explicitly notes that those who fall into this fire of dependency will have no true ansar.
Because a nation relying on the charity of others has no true global allies. In the brutal reality of geopolitics, the dominant nations that are throwing those scraps do not view the recipient nation as an equal partner.
No, they view them with deep contempt.
Exactly. The aid is a leash. The loans are a mechanism of control.
You cannot buy a true alliance with subservience. I mean, if a powerful nation builds a port in a struggling nation, it's not out of the goodness of their hearts. They want the port for their own military or trade access.
Precisely.
The struggling nation might call them an ansar, an ally, but in reality, they are just a landlord.
This is what Parwez identifies as a permanent value, or a mustakila qadar. True human dignity and societal sovereignty are completely incompatible with economic dependency.
So it's a binary.
It is. If you ignore the objective realities of the physical universe, you fall into the fire of socioeconomic ruin. You live a life of subjugation and humiliation in this world.
Okay, let's pivot, because the diagnosis here is pretty grim. If abandoning the physical world leads to this earthly hell of dependency and humiliation, what is the mechanism to avoid it? Like, how does a society snap out of the mirage mindset?
Well, that brings us to the third linguistic shift we need to talk about, the redefinition of Ayman and Momin.
Okay, because the traditional, widely accepted view of Ayman is faith, but specifically blind faith, inherited belief, believing in the unseen without requiring proof.
Right, but in a rationalist system, defining faith as blind is a contradiction in terms. A Momin, which is the systemic term for a true believer, is someone who attains absolute conviction. The Arabic term is yaqin.
Yaqin.
Yes. But this conviction is not attained by shutting one's eyes. It is attained through active intellect, relentless reasoning, and the rigorous empirical observation of the universe.
Wait, you're saying that observing the physical world is a prerequisite for faith? That, like, studying biology is a requirement to be a moment?
Yes.
That feels like it blurs the line between a scientist and a cleric
Yeah.
to the point where the distinction just disappears.
The sources argue that in this paradigm, there should be no distinction. The text uses two vital terms here, afak and anfas.
What do those mean?
Afak refers to the macrocosm, the external universe, the cosmos, geological formations, biological life, the movement of tectonic plates.
Okay, the big picture stuff.
Right. And anfas refers to the microcosm, human psychology, sociology, the inner workings of consciousness.
Got it.
True faith requires studying both. It acts as the catalyst for establishing a socioeconomic order. You cannot inherit absolute conviction from your parents. You have to empirically validate it by continuously studying the laws of nature and bringing human intellect into alignment with the overarching ethical principles of divine revelation.
That is a total paradigm shift. I mean, we've moved from a model where faith is tested by how much you can ignore the physical world
Right.
to a model where faith is measured by how deeply you understand the physical world.
Exactly.
Faith is grabbing a telescope, looking through an electron microscope, and uncovering the laws of physics.
And once a society redefines its vocabulary, once they realize the universe is real, dependency is hell, and scientific observation is faith, they finally possess the raw materials to construct a new reality.
Okay.
The text then transitions from establishing the vocabulary to instructing the society on how to actually build the machinery of state.
Which brings us to the core of this deep dive, the economic engine. We've decoded the labels on the parts, now we have to actually assemble the machine.
Let's do it.
We start with verse 193, which introduces a monumental concept in Parwez's interpretation, rububiyat.
Rububiyat is the operational heart of this civilizational blueprint. It is the universal system of nourishment, sustenance, and developmental growth.
So it's an economic system.
It is, but it's not just about keeping people alive. It's about providing the necessary resources for every individual to reach their absolute highest potential from inception to maturity.
I want to look at the term rab for a second, because often in traditional translations, Rab is rendered simply as Lord, which, evokes an image of a monarch sitting on a throne.
Right, a very anthropomorphic view.
Yeah, but systemically, it's a functional title. The Rab is the guarantor of this Rubuat. It represents the authority, the mechanism that ensures this universal sustenance actually happens in the real world.
And this requires a highly structured socioeconomic contract. It's not a system that relies on random acts of individual charity. It requires a triadic relationship to function.
3 pillars.
3 distinct pillars that must operate in perfect synchronization.
Okay, let's break down the triad. Pillar 1 is the individual, right?
Oh, correct.
So the individual citizen's mandate is to use their intellect and their senses to conquer the forces of nature.
Yeah.
They are the ones doing the empirical observation we just talked about.
Yes.
They are the scientists, the engineers, the hydrologists, the farmers, the innovators who figure out how to extract energy and grow food.
Exactly. Pillar 2 is the Milat, the collective community.
Okay, what do they do?
The collective has a very specific oversight role. They must ensure that the forces of nature conquered by the individuals are not hoarded. They must prevent the technological and agricultural advancements from being used for selfish human desires or capitalistic exploitation.
Let me stop you there, because that sounds like a potential friction point. I mean, if the individual uses their brilliance to invent a new way to purify water, human nature dictates they might want to monetize that and become incredibly wealthy.
Sure, naturally.
So the millet steps in and says, no, water purification belongs to the collective. Isn't there a danger of suppressing individual drive there?
That tension is exactly why the 3rd pillar exists. Pillar 3 is the Markaz, the central authority.
Oh, okay.
The Markaz is the integrating engine. It takes the scientific power generated by the individual, navigates the collective needs of the millet, and binds it all to the permanent ethical values of divine revelation, Wahi.
So it's the regulator.
Yes. The Markaz acts as the worldly mechanism of Rububiyat. Its mandate is to utilize physical forces, whether that's water, agriculture, or atomic energy, to ensure equitable economic sustenance. Authority is only considered legitimate in this system when it successfully provides universal sustenance without resorting to exploitation or tyranny.
Let me try to visualize this with an analogy just to make sure I have it right.
Go for it.
The Markaz isn't just a spiritual figurehead giving sermons. It is the central processing unit of a massive, perfectly calibrated irrigation system.
Okay, I like that.
The individuals are the ones who figure out how to build the reservoir and pump the water from the deep earth. The Malat is the network of fields that need the water. But the Markaz is the system of valves and ethical pressure regulators.
Right.
Its only job is to ensure the water, meaning the wealth, the resources, the technology, flows through the pipes and reaches every single crop in the field, leaving absolutely no one to wither from drought.
The mechanics of that analogy are perfectly sound. And look at the failure points. If the individual fails to conquer nature, the reservoir is empty.
Right.
There is no water to distribute, and the society falls into the fire of dependency. If the Milat fails to engage, the system fractures. But if the Markaz fails to integrate ethical values, corruption takes over.
So a few massive corporate crops bribe the gatekeepers, hoard all the water, and the rest of the field turns to dust.
Exactly. And Parwez isn't just outlining a vague utopian philosophy here. The sources pull 4 very specific, aggressively actionable policy mandates from this interpretation.
4 mandates.
Yes, and we need to look at these mandates not as political suggestions, but as the strict architectural framework demanded by these verses.
All right, let's go through them.
The mandates are entirely uncompromising. Let's examine the first one. The eradication of the charity economy.
Okay.
According to this systemic blueprint, a state must systematically and legally dismantle its reliance on foreign aid and international loans.
Because, referring back to our vocabulary, that reliance is literally nar. It is the worldly hellfire.
It is.
But how does a nation actually do that? If a country is deeply in debt to international monetary organizations, they can't just flip a switch and say, hey, we don't want your money anymore. The transition mechanics seem incredibly volatile.
Well, the transition begins with a complete cultural and legal reclassification. Domestic reliance on foreign loans must be classified not as a necessary economic strategy, but as a state of supreme disgrace or aksai tahu.
So it becomes a point of national shame.
Yes, achieving absolute economic self-sustainment becomes the primary objective of national defense. It requires a society to prioritize domestic production over imported consumption, even if it means enduring extreme austerity in the short term.
Wow, austerity.
Because the moral imperative is clear. You cannot claim to be a sovereign, dignified nation while another nation pays for your infrastructure.
That austerity would require immense internal cohesion, which leads perfectly to mandate number 2, I think,
Yeah.
a mandatory scientific outlook. We mentioned studying nature earlier, but this mandate completely restructures the state education system. The state must fund, prioritize, and relentlessly pursue empirical research.
And the critical shift here is that funding science is not viewed as a secular, discretionary budget item.
It's not just a line item.
No, it is a fundamental religious obligation. The educational policies of the state must actively eradicate the lingering philosophical belief that the material world is an illusion. Scientific discovery is the mandatory prerequisite to fulfilling the social contract of rubaiyat.
So in this framework, you cannot separate scientific education from religious education. They are one and the same.
Exactly the same.
Studying the tectonic plates is a religious act, because if you don't understand the tectonic plates, you can't build earthquake-resistant housing. And if you can't protect your citizens from earthquakes, you fail to provide universal sustenance, and your authority becomes illegitimate.
Exactly. The mastery of geology, biology, and physics is the tool set required to actualize the ethical demands of wahi. Without the science, the ethics are just empty platitudes. You cannot feed the hungry with good intentions. You feed them with advanced agricultural technology.
That is so practical. Let's move to mandate number 3, which deals with how you manage that physical environment once you understand it. Sovereign resource management.
Right.
To ensure the irrigation system works and everyone is nourished, the state has to conquer and manage its own natural resources.
If a nation discovers vast reserves of oil or lithium or rare earth metals, but relies on foreign multinational corporations to extract, manage, or subsidize those resources, they are violating the core systemic principle of adl, which is justice.
I mean, I see this constantly in modern geopolitics. A nation in the global south has incredible mineral wealth, but they lack the refining infrastructure.
So what happens?
So a foreign conglomerate comes in, sets up the mines, extracts the raw material, takes like 80% of the profit, ships the raw material overseas to be refined, and then sells the finished product back to the original country at a premium.
And that scenario is the precise definition of subjugating the community to the economic fire of external exploiters.
Wow.
The mandate demands that the state must develop its own intellectual and industrial capacity to extract and refine its resources. Handing over the keys to your natural wealth because you lack the scientific capability to manage it is a fundamental failure of the markaz.
And if you fix that, it changes how you interact with the rest of the world, which is mandate number 4. Reevaluating alliances.
Yes.
Diplomatic relations must be fundamentally restructured. They must be built on mutual scientific and economic strength, not subservience.
The Malat must confront a harsh geopolitical reality. An economically dependent nation has no friends.
It's tough, but true.
If your foreign policy is based on negotiating better terms for aid or pleading for debt forgiveness, you must understand that the nations sitting across the table are looking at you with contempt. You have no ansar.
You are a client state. You are a buffer zone. You are a resource depot. You are not an ally.
Therefore, true alliances that actually protect the society and foster mutual growth, are only valid when they are forged between self-sustaining, scientifically capable nations. You bring equal weight to the table. You trade from a position of sovereign strength, not desperate need.
Okay, so we've established the vocabulary. We've built the economic engine of Rububiyat with its triad of individual, collective, and central authority. We've outlined the 4 rigorous policies required to maintain it.
We have the blueprint.
But this begs a massive overarching question. What if a society just looks at this blueprint and says, no thanks?
That happened.
What if a culture decides they prefer mystic meditation and ignoring the physical world? Or what if they decide they love science, but they want to use it for unchecked exploitative capitalism instead of equitable distribution? Where is the enforcement mechanism?
The enforcement mechanism is not an external police force, nor is it a divine lightning bolt.
Okay.
This brings us to the third core concept extracted from these verses, the social physics, or the Law of Requital. In Arabic, the term is mukafat amal.
Mukafat-e-amal. And this is where the framework becomes incredibly cold and calculating.
It's very objective.
Because traditional theology often frames punishment as a conscious act of divine wrath. You broke a rule, so an angry deity decides to send a plague or a flood to teach you a lesson. But Parwez completely removes the anthropomorphic anger from the equation. The punishment is just social physics.
Right, the law of requital operates with the same detached inevitability as the laws of thermodynamics or gravity.
Gravity.
Yes. If you walk off the roof of a 10-story building, gravity pulls you down. Gravity isn't punishing you. Gravity isn't angry that you made a bad decision. It is simply a fundamental, inescapable law of the physical universe.
Okay.
Parwez argues that human societies are governed by equally inescapable laws of social physics. If a society fails to conquer the material world, they will inevitably face earthly disgrace and starvation.
So the fire we talked about earlier isn't a magical curse. It is the scientific consequence of economic neglect.
Precisely.
A nation doesn't experience famine because God is mad at them.
Yeah.
They experience famine because they stopped studying hydrology, they failed to build the reservoir, and they ignored the agricultural science necessary to survive a drought.
The verses establish that nar is the direct, natural consequence of neglecting the physical universe or misusing its forces. And Parwez outlines dual warnings here. The text identifies two distinct fires of imbalance that a society can plunge into.
Okay, let's examine the first trap, the ascetic or mystic trap. We've touched on this a bit.
Yes, the withdrawal.
This is the society that withdraws from the physical world. They adopt the Platonic ideal, they reject the empirical sciences, they view the pursuit of wealth and infrastructure as spiritually corrupting, and they retreat into isolated meditation.
And the mukafat imal, the inescapable scientific consequence for this societal behavior, is the earthly hell of military subjugation and abject poverty.
Because they possess no scientific power.
Right. They have no modern agriculture to feed their population, and they have no advanced weaponry or logistical infrastructure to defend their borders. They are easily conquered by any neighboring nation that did study metallurgy and physics.
So they sit in their monasteries waiting for an afterlife heaven while living in a completely avoidable worldly hell.
Exactly.
That trap seems obvious once you lay it out. But the second trap is far more insidious, and honestly, it feels uncomfortably relevant right now.
The secular or exploitative trap.
Yes. This is a society that fully embraces the hardware. They conquer nature. They map the human genome. They split the atom. They build global digital networks and aerospace technology.
They possess immense scientific capability.
But, and this is the big bow, but they completely discard the ethical permanent values of divine revelation, the Wahi.
They possess the intellect, but they lack the ethical compass. And Parwez argues that this trap perfectly describes much of the modern, industrialized world.
How so?
They attain unimaginable material prosperity, they generate massive wealth. But because they lack the permanent ethical values to guide and regulate that power, they plunge the global community into a completely different kind of fire.
I'd call it a psychological fire.
It is. It is a fire of deep, pervasive societal anxiety. It manifests as global chaos, extreme wealth inequality, where billions live in poverty while a few hoard the resources, the constant looming threat of mutually assured nuclear destruction.
The deployment of brilliant scientific knowledge, primarily for capitalistic exploitation and warfare. To bring back our irrigation analogy, they have built the most incredible, high-tech reservoir and piping system ever conceived. The water is flowing perfectly. But instead of using that water to ensure every crop is fed, they are using high-pressure hoses to flood and destroy the fields of their competitors while hoarding the rest in private vats.
That is a perfect extension of the analogy. They conquered the AFAC, the external universe, but they ignored the ethical boundaries required to manage it. The result is a society that is physically prosperous, but psychologically terrified and constantly on the brink of self-annihilation.
So on one side of the spectrum, you have spiritual detachment, leading inevitably to physical destruction and starvation. On the other side, you have physical mastery, leading inevitably to psychological terror and global exploitation.
Right.
So what is the actual solution? Where is the equilibrium in this system?
The equilibrium is the synthesis. It is the true Momen paradigm. It requires walking the exact middle path, aggressively utilizing the universe's physical forces, but confining that massive power strictly within the ethical boundaries of Wahi.
You take the raw, brilliant power of the secular trap, and you bind it with the ethical restraints that the ascetic trap abandoned.
Yes. You implement systemic regulations through the markaz, ensuring that scientific advancements are harnessed exclusively for rububiyat.
Universal sustenance.
Exactly. Atomic energy is not used to build warheads to threaten neighbors. It is used to provide clean, limitless energy to power hospitals and desalination plants. When a society successfully marries the pursuit of knowledge with the mandate of universal, equitable sustenance, they transform earthly existence.
They avoid both fires.
They avoid the fire entirely and create a state of universal security, free from the fear of exploitation and the despair of poverty.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of this text. Verse 194. It acts as the outro to this incredible civilizational blueprint. The text describes the believers petitioning the central authority to fulfill a very specific monumental promise.
The promise of istiqlal fil ard.
Let's translate that systemically. What does that promise actually mean for a society that implements this engine?
It translates directly to the granting of geopolitical authority, long-term stability, succession, and sovereign governance on Earth.
That's huge.
It is the ultimate permanent value, the mustaqila qadar. It is an immutable guarantee written into the social physics of the divine law. Any society that successfully operationalizes the synthesis of empirical scientific power and Quranic ethics is absolutely guaranteed to achieve stability, true independence, and global empowerment.
It is not a mystical wish.
Yeah.
It is a mathematical equation of social physics. Mastery of science plus the ethics of revelation equals sovereign authority.
And the inverse of that equation is equally immutable. Legitimate authority only exists when it successively provides that universal sustenance without exploitation.
Right.
If a governing body fails to provide rububiyat, if it allows poverty and extreme disparity to flourish while hoarding wealth, it fundamentally loses its legitimacy. And according to the Law of Requital, it will inevitably collapse and fall to the fire of dependency or revolution.
Let's bring this all the way back to you, listening right now. What does this deep dive mean for how you interact with the world today?
It's a big question.
For one, if you interact with these texts, you can no longer look at these verses in Surah Al-Imran as a simple, passive prayer to memorize for a bit of good luck.
No, you can't.
They aren't just beautiful calligraphy in a wooden frame.
Oh.
They are a demanding, rigorous, and frankly exhausting constitutional framework. They demand that you look at the physical world around you. The politics, the economy, the infrastructure, the scientific advancements, not as a secular illusion to be ignored, but as your greatest and most urgent responsibility.
It is a total redefinition of purpose.
Yeah.
It shifts faith from an internal, private, emotionally comforting feeling to an external, highly visible societal obligation.
You are mandated to build a better, scientifically advanced, and fiercely equitable world. We've established today that this text provides a foolproof, external blueprint for an economic engine. An engine designed specifically to conquer nature and prevent a society from falling into the worldly fire of foreign dependency and subjugation. We have the vocabulary, we have the mechanics, and we know the physics of what happens if we fail.
We do.
But looking at this perfect engine leaves us with a massive, glaring cliffhanger.
The internal vulnerability of any perfect system.
Right. Because what happens when the existential threat isn't a lack of scientific knowledge? What happens when the threat isn't a foreign superpower offering predatory IMF loans?
What happens when the threat is a lack of internal cohesion?
Exactly. If this is the perfect irrigation system, how does this socioeconomic framework handle a wrench purposefully thrown into the gears by its own people? How does it deal with corruption from within the markaz itself?
That is a question of systemic treason.
And it's exactly the vulnerability we need to explore next time. Until then, remember, don't just admire the frame. Read the blueprint. Stand steadfast in the system and never let anyone convince you the physical world doesn't matter. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.